The sensor logs and pict-feeds that first drew attention to 14020 were fragmentary. Fractured vox bursts, corrupted telemetry, and the last ragged transmission from a Blood Angel's captain, whose voice clipped over static. Field teams who later reviewed the recovered imagery described landing shuttles scattering beneath violent localized storms and squads being cut off from one another before entire landing parties vanished from view. Archaeological teams that later visited the orbit of the system catalogued the impressions left in Imperial records. Designation 14020, a fleet marker in the 140th expeditionary sequence, and a terse distress call that became the planet's informal name. The archival entry that closes these early reports reproduces the surviving Vox clip in full. This world is murder. This is the subject of the present account, the fate of the planet Murder. Subsequent Imperial after-action summaries are more detailed but still constrained by the limits of battlefield reporting and the censoring that follows any operation involving lost companies of Astartes. The first force to descend was the Blood Angels company attached to the 140th Expeditionary Fleet. Their leader, Captain Ketus Frome, issued the final known transmission after contact broke down. The records consistently note that the planet was renamed in the wake of that transmission, and the phrase became shorthand across multiple reporting fleets for the sequence that followed. The initial tactical picture, shuttles dispersed by sudden violent turbulence and small detachments forced to fight alone, reoccurs across independent witness statements compiled from Lunar Wolves and Emperor's Children logs. When the Emperor's Children detachment arrived in response to the Blood Angels' distress calls, their landing party suffered similar disorganization. A patrol led by the Emperor's Children captain Saul Tarvitz encountered what the field reports variously describe as rock-like monoliths or dead tree analogues. The structures proved to be more than passive terrain. On their branches were the corpses of Blood Angels, impaled and arranged in a pattern that survivors termed an obvious predatory display. Removal or destruction of several such constructs coincided with a measurable clearing of the local atmosphere. The turbulence that had scattered landing ships abated in the cleared sectors, allowing larger elements to reassemble and a wider assault to proceed. These details are recorded in consolidated campaign notes from Great Crusade dispatches. The xenos force responsible for the losses was later catalogued under the field designation Megarachnids. Contemporary biological reports drafted from battlefield forensics describe a group of arthropodiform creatures that combined extreme physical resilience with predatory specializations unusual among recorded xenos. Survivors and later biological sketches record 8 primary appendages, with 4 used primarily for locomotion and 4 modified into long blade-like forelimbs capable of cleaving ceramite under combat conditions. The carapace and claws were reported to possess an organically produced metal-like composition that resisted small arms fire and chewed through powered armor with lethal efficiency. Observers also noted the absence of conventional ocular organs. Tracking and target acquisition appeared to derive from alternate sensory organs and coordinated swarm behavior, mediated by a form of substrate or acoustic clicking that served as intra-group communication. These anatomical summaries are consistent across legionary sketch reports and summary entries in Imperial reference compendia. Strategic and operational responses to the Megarachnids escalated rapidly. Warmaster leadership diverted reinforcements, elements of the Lunar Wolves, legions of Imperial army, and siege support from Legio Mortis Titans were committed to a sustained campaign once the atmospheric barrier was partially neutralized. Records of the campaign chronicle 6 months of active combat operations in which Astartes detachments and Imperial army formations undertook the methodical destruction of the tree-like weather constructs and the systematic clearing of ground-level nests. The fighting was attritional and costly. Multiple companies reported heavy casualties. The consolidated operational history refers to the engagement as the War on Murder, and records that the campaign was interrupted by contact with an external human polity rather than concluded by extermination alone. That external polity identified itself as the Interrex. The Intrex response ships arrived in the aftermath of Imperial bombardment and surface operations to rebuke the invading forces for violating an orbital exclusion established around the world, which the Intrex described as a quarantine zone. Intrex diplomats and star charts, preserved in fragmentary Intrex transcripts and summarized in Imperial after-action appendices, assert that the Megarachnids had been defeated in an earlier conflict by Intrex forces, stripped of interstellar capability, and relocated to the world the Intrex called Urisarach as a form of containment. Imperial command records reflect a sharp policy divergence at that point. The War Master ordered a halt to active extermination operations to open first contact negotiations, a decision that generated recorded dissent among several senior commanders who regarded the planet's population as an offensive existential threat. The Intrex account and the Imperium's operational record remain the clearest extant explanations for the presence and confinement of the Megarachnids on that world. The material evidence collected from the surface, what could be safely recovered and later catalogued, presents a mixed but coherent picture. Sections of destroyed trees were returned in fragmentary form to embarkation points and subjected to mechanical and chemical analysis. Samples noted unusual composite fibers and laminated plates that were in some cases biological in origin, but mineral in behavior. The constructs contained resonant cavities and arrays that suggested an engineered purpose for manipulating localized airflow and electrical discharge. Forensic mapping of storm trajectories and the positions of these constructs established a causal correlation. Where trees were present, sustained and quasi-localized storms persisted. Where trees were destroyed, the storms abated or were diverted. The field engineers and Mechanicus surveyors who filed the technical appendices treated the devices as deliberate weather control mechanisms, whether of xenos manufacture or the degraded remains of older engineered technologies now co-opted by the xenos. These technical appendices informed the operational decision to commit siege assets to the direct destruction of tree sites rather than to full orbital bombardment. Contemporary accounts emphasize the forensic difficulty of distinguishing artifact from ecosystem. The Megarachnids appear to have integrated these constructs into their life cycle and hunting strategy. They rebuilt them rapidly after Imperial strikes and defended them with tens of thousands of warriors moving in coordinated waves. Observers compared the behavior to a kind of engineered habitat maintenance. The structures regulated weather and conferred tactical advantage, while the Megarachnids supplied bio-labor and protection. The capacity to reconstitute these devices under combat stress suggested either distributed and resilient manufacture, improvised construction using local materials and biomatter, or an embedded biological capacity that the investigators could not resolve at the time of retrieval. Mechanicus commentary from the period recorded this as a priority research question, but one that was superseded by political exigency when the Intrex entered the theatre. Descriptions of Megarachnid social organization are sparse and derived almost entirely from combat observation, rather than long-term ethnography. Imperial reports repeatedly emphasize swarm organization, division of labor by form and size, and a strong predatory hierarchy. Field artist notes and fragmentary sketches label morphological variants, ground warriors, flying hunters, and larger brood forms, with implied role specializations. Those sketches indicate the presence of large flight-capable variants that patrolled the canopy and were observed lifting or displacing medium-sized loads and carrion. Tactical reports record coordinated assaults in which aerial units isolated pockets of resistance, while ground clades executed flanking and encirclement maneuvers. Those maneuvers exhibited a degree of tactical sophistication sufficient to defeat multiple isolated Astartes detachments before reinforcements could reassemble. The surviving analytical summaries treat these observations as behavioral evidence of both an advanced, if alien, social coordination and an explicitly aggressive disposition toward humanoid intruders. The human element in the official campaigns is notable for its recorded frustration and the moral ambiguities that arise when an advanced human civilization intervenes to protect a population that other human forces consider a menace. The Intrex records, limited in Imperial archives to the extant summaries of diplomatic transcripts, portray the transplantation as a deliberate containment decision made after a prior war in which Intrex forces overcame the Megarachnids. The Intrex position frames their treatment of the species as a pragmatic necessity, to shield galactic commerce from an irreducibly violent lifeform without resorting to outright genocide. Imperial reporting frames the Intrex action as stewardship, and some Imperial officers later interpreted the quarantine as an ethical restraint that complicated the Imperium's expansionist and martial imperatives. The clash of priorities, extermination for security versus containment for preservation of a living population, becomes an operational pivot in the campaign record and explains the abrupt curtailment of the war on murder. The material culture recorded at the margins of the conflict was unevenly preserved. Legionary honours later applied to a handful of surviving war machines, and the heraldic marks noted on recovered transports indicate a memory of the campaign in later chapter histories. Mechanicus fragments mention relic marks, and a commemoration sequence preserved on certain Imperialist vehicles that would persist into later millennia as an archival footnote, a cipher referencing the planet's expeditionary number. Those artifacts supply a corroborating line of evidence that the operational losses were real, and that the engagement left lasting marks on Legion records, even if many of the finer details of Megarachnid society remain unrecorded in Imperial annals. From the perspective of field archaeology, the engagement on 14020 is frequently cited as an example of the limits of military retrieval operations when faced with a biotechnical ecosystem. The expeditionary forces prioritized neutralizing immediate kinetic threats and securing routes for evacuation, and did so at the cost of systematic, long-term collection. The surviving pict-feeds and ground-level forensics therefore present an imperfect record. Fragments of construct plating, partial biomechanical samples, sketches of carcass disposition, and the vox fragments of the last transmissions. The Mechanicus appendices that survive in the archives are cautious in their language, consistently marking several observations as inconclusive when the evidence could be read multiple ways. The conservatism is notable in later reference works that synthesize the campaign. They record both the biological description of the Megarachnids and the procedural decisions taken by command without asserting a definitive origin story for the constructs or the full extent of the species' capabilities. The aggregated record leaves specific, bounded conclusions intact. 14020 was catalogued as a death world upon Imperial recognition. Its inhabitants were identified in dispatches and field sketches as Megarachnids. The planet's unusual weather phenomena were causally associated with artificial repeatable constructs which the invaders destroyed to clear landing corridors. And the arrival of the Intrex and their claim of prior containment resulted in the cessation of large-scale Imperial extermination efforts. Beyond these discrete facts, gaps remain. The long-term fate of the Megarachnids after the Imperium's withdrawal, the degree to which the Intrex retained guardianship after contact, and the detailed evolutionary origin of the constructs are not recorded in surviving Imperial dossiers. These lacunae are the primary constraints facing any subsequent archival reconstruction of the planet's full history. The eyewitness threads that form the base of this chapter therefore converge on a narrow set of verifiable events. Initial discovery by a Blood Angels company, catastrophic early losses and a final data stream that named the world, tactical identification of artificial weather control devices employed by a highly resilient arachnid xenos, a prolonged and costly extermination effort, and the political interruption of that effort by contact with an advanced human polity asserting prior jurisdiction. The planetary surface of 14020 presented an ecological profile that, even by Deathworld standards, defied simple classification. Early orbital scans misidentified the planet's dominant coloration and thermal signatures as those of a densely vegetated biosphere. Closer analysis through atmospheric interference, however, revealed that much of what appeared to be jungle canopy was in fact a vast network of artificial growths, metallic or mineral composites fused with organic matter. These constructs dominated Murder's geography as far as auger sweeps could detect, forming an interlocking matrix of spire-like growths that spread across continents in seemingly natural yet artificially consistent patterns. Geologically, the planet's crust was stable, suggesting long-term tectonic dormancy. No recent volcanic or seismic activity was recorded during the initial descent phases. The terrain beneath the canopy was comprised primarily of dark basaltic plateaus interrupted by silicate plains, some carved by what were once riverbeds or flood basins long since desiccated. Surface moisture readings showed the existence of shallow aquifers near the equatorial zones, though water in open form was rare. Analysis from recovered samples later confirmed that the planet's surface liquids possessed high concentrations of metallic ions and organic detritus, likely runoff from the countless construct trees that towered across the surface. The planetary climate was dominated by an atmosphere both breathable and deadly in equal measure. Atmospheric density was slightly higher than that of Terra's, with measurable traces of ozone, sulfur oxides, and particulate debris consistent with ongoing electrical storm activity. The lower stratosphere exhibited periodic lightning discharges, powerful enough to scramble shuttle guidance systems and blind auger arrays. Air currents formed violent, self-sustaining storm patterns, seemingly influenced by the massive latticework of tree-like structures. Observers from the Lunar Wolves expedition would later determine that these formations functioned as naturalized weather control systems, organisms or constructs designed to induce storms for planetary defense or ecological balance. The electrical and barometric disturbances they created formed a protective barrier that shielded surface life from easy observation or bombardment. The flora of Murder was both minimal and overwhelming. Where traditional vegetation might have existed, it had long since been subsumed or eradicated by the dominant biomechanical lattice. The so-called trees were not living in the botanical sense, yet neither were they entirely inert. Closer study by Adeptus Mechanicus observers, conducted in the weeks after partial atmospheric clearing, revealed microfilamentary growth patterns along their surfaces, suggestive of regenerative or self-replicating systems. Beneath the outer carapace of each construct were networks of fibrous channels that pulsed faintly with biological fluids. These channels displayed rhythmic electrical discharges synchronized with the planet's broader storm cycles, implying a planetary-scale biosystem in which each tree functioned both as organ and node. The trees were immense. Average height exceeded 100 meters, with base diameters ranging between 20 and 50 meters depending on terrain density. Their roots burrowed deep, forming intricate meshes that stabilized the upper soil layers. When cross-sectioned, fragments revealed hollow internal chambers coated in resin-like secretions. The Mechanicus compared these to honeycombs or nerve clusters, theorizing that the structures acted as both atmospheric regulators and shelters for native life forms. Those life forms, the Megarachnids, coexisted symbiotically with their artificial habitat. Early field notes written by Emperor's Children scouts describe swarms emerging directly from within the trees themselves, as if the organisms were not merely residents but integral components of the system. Excavations of several destroyed constructs showed dormant cocoons adhered to the inner walls, from which smaller juvenile Megarachnids were believed to hatch. It was concluded that the trees doubled as brood nests and environmental regulators, gestation chambers that maintained optimal humidity and temperature for spawning. Aside from the Megarachnids, the planet's biosphere supported only secondary life forms, each seemingly adapted to serve or coexist within the dominant xenoecological framework. Winged scavenger species were observed feeding on the carcasses left impaled upon the upper branches, their physiology suggesting minor evolutionary divergence from the Megarachnid genome. These scavengers, described as leathery, bat-like forms with 6 limbs and segmented tails, displayed hive behavior but little aggression toward humans unless provoked. Their role appeared limited to carrion consumption and organic recycling. Smaller ground-dwelling creatures resembling insects or crustaceans were also encountered, though their populations were sparse. Most appeared to feed on detritus secreted by the larger organisms or by the decay of destroyed constructs. Biochemical analysis of these subordinate species revealed consistent protein structures and chitinous materials matching the primary megarachnid composition. This led Mechanicus bioengineers to hypothesize that Murder's entire ecology was artificially sculpted or genetically manipulated from a single root species, refined over millennia into a complete self-regulating biosystem. In essence, Murder's environment was not natural, but designed. A planet-wide biological machine governed by principles of predation, recycling, and control of atmospheric phenomena. The planet's meteorology reinforced this artificial patterning. The storm systems that plagued early Imperial landings were not random. Data correlations across expeditionary logs show clear rhythmic intervals in which wind speeds and pressure systems rose and fell with near mathematical regularity. The trees emitted low-frequency vibrations detectable through Auspex sensors, generating electrical charges that accumulated in the dense, humid atmosphere. Once critical energy levels were reached, massive lightning discharges would occur, radiating outward and dissipating through the conductive canopy structures. These discharges were both destructive and self-sustaining, feeding energy back into the planetary system through induction and magnetic resonance. For Astartes forces attempting descent, this meant disaster. Storm patterns were strongest around large hive-like regions, where the concentration of constructs was densest. Transport craft were thrown off course or torn apart mid-descent, their fuselages collapsing under electrostatic interference. Surface teams reported losing Vox contact within seconds of entering the lower atmosphere, a condition the Mechanicus later attributed to the electromagnetic harmonics generated by the tree structures themselves. In practical terms, the entire planet functioned as a naturally occurring and self-repairing defense grid. Geographically, Murder was divided into 5 major continental masses and several minor archipelagos, all interconnected by shallow equatorial seas. Polar regions were covered not by ice, but by metallic plains, reflective enough to scatter orbital scans. It was within these reflective zones that the Mechanicus eventually discovered massive deposits of non-biological alloys, presumed to be remnants of long-lost megarachnid infrastructure or prior civilizations. The deposits contained trace elements of ferrite composites and ceramite-like materials, arranged in geometric lattices that did not occur naturally. No signs of human or xenos habitation were found near them, suggesting either complete abandonment or deliberate concealment. Surface temperatures varied dramatically depending on proximity to the storm regions. Equatorial zones were hot and humid, averaging 40 degrees Celsius under constant electrical activity. The air there smelled of ozone and wet metal, described by survivors as a taste of iron and lightning. In contrast, temperate zones were cooler, though no less dangerous. Winds carried metallic dust, capable of eroding exposed skin and corroding unsealed equipment. Those who operated without full helmets for extended periods developed lesions consistent with particulate ion burns. The soundscape of Murder was as distinctive as its geography. Continuous subsonic hums resonated through the ground, likely emanations from the tree's internal cavities, accompanied by the ever-present clicking of megarachnid movement. Many field reports describe the noise as omnidirectional, making it impossible to determine the creature's approach. In several cases, these acoustic distortions caused severe disorientation in human personnel, leading to accidental falls or misfires. It is presumed that the megarachnids exploited this as a sensory weapon, relying on their natural immunity to the frequency ranges they themselves produced. The fauna of Murder was thus inseparable from its environment. The megarachnids occupied both predator and ecological engineer roles, maintaining the integrity of the planet's biomechanical lattice through constant activity. Observations indicate that when constructs were destroyed, the creatures immediately began repair cycles, collecting debris, excreting binding resin, and restoring damaged structures within days. This regenerative capacity suggests a level of environmental integration unparalleled in known xenos species. While most predatory life forms operate independently of habitat function, the megarachnids were the habitat. Physically, megarachnids varied in size from smaller worker forms, roughly 2 meters long, to colossal hunting variants exceeding 8 meters. Each shared the same general morphology: a thick layered exoskeleton, multi-jointed limbs ending in monomolecularly sharp talons, and a head crest divided into plates concealing sensory pits. Despite their arachnid classification, they lacked traditional web structures. Instead, they employed resin-based traps and ambush zones, often at the periphery of tree clusters. Within these zones, captured prey, whether animal or human, were hoisted and impaled on the spire branches, both as sustenance and territorial marking. The use of impalement as deterrent behaviour was later confirmed through comparative xenological study, suggesting an instinctual psychological warfare adaptation. Smaller megarachnids functioned as drones, maintaining structure integrity, while the larger caste, colloquially termed hunters in field reports, acted as active defenders. Even larger queen-like organisms were hypothesized but never confirmed. Autopsies performed on recovered corpses revealed complex internal anatomy: multi-chambered lungs adapted for high oxygen environments, dual circulatory systems, and a hardened cranial core protecting a neural cluster. Of particular interest to the Mechanicus was the neural structure, which displayed lattice-like patterns of metallic trace elements. This hybridization of biological and metallic components suggested a naturally evolved bioelectrical network capable of local processing and coordination. In essence, each organism may have functioned as both soldier and sensory node for the planetary ecosystem. In the Northern Hemisphere, a distinct biome emerged, colder and less saturated with atmospheric storms. Here, the constructs grew lower, denser and interwoven, forming an almost subterranean forest. Within these areas, the megarachnids displayed different behaviour: slower, more deliberate movement, and reduced aggression until provoked. Speculation exists that these were the species' nesting regions, areas of reproduction and metamorphosis. The temperature differential might have been essential for developmental stages of their young. Meteorological conditions remained harsh throughout the campaign. Even after months of systematic bombardment and the destruction of thousands of trees, the weather system showed only temporary stabilization. Mechanicus reports concluded that Murder's ecosystem had achieved a state of dynamic equilibrium. Every environmental disruption, whether through battle or natural decay, triggered self-correcting processes. Lightning activity would surge, storm belts would relocate, and pressure gradients would shift until equilibrium was re-established. The pattern resembled machine intelligence, though evidence of conscious planetary control was never confirmed. No lunar bodies orbited Murder, though traces of shattered debris suggested at least one former moon. The lack of lunar stabilization may have contributed to the extreme meteorological conditions, as tidal and magnetic fields fluctuated unpredictably. Nevertheless, the planet maintained a consistent rotation period of 23 standard hours, and an axial tilt generating discernible seasonal variation. These details, while minor in isolation, contributed to the overall picture of a world that balanced on the edge of constant violence, yet retained underlying systemic precision. The flora and fauna of Murder therefore cannot be understood in isolation from one another. The trees were not mere background, and the megarachnids were not isolated predators. They formed a single integrated organism, planetary in scale and relentless in function. To the Imperium's explorers, Murder was a nightmare of instinct made manifest. To the Mechanicus, it was an ecological machine, one that redefined the boundary between life and technology. Every destroyed spire, every slain creature seemed to invite replacement from beneath the ground or within the walls of the nearest construct. The balance of Murder was unyielding. When the storms finally subsided and the Mechanicus established stable scanning posts, they attempted to measure the total planetary population. Estimates varied wildly. Conservative numbers placed the megarachnid count in the tens of millions. Others, based on movement signatures detected across multiple continents, suggested far higher. Regardless, it was evident that the species had saturated every accessible region of the surface. The density of construct growth supported this theory. Wherever trees existed, so did Megarachnids. To the Adeptus Administratum, this rendered the world unfit for colonization or exploitation. To the Mechanicus, it represented a potential discovery of bioengineering principles lost to the dark age of technology. The planet's self-regulating storms and environmental equilibrium indicated a form of planetary maintenance no longer reproducible by contemporary human science. Had the Intrix not intervened, it is likely the Mechanicus would have petitioned for long-term study and resource harvesting. In the end, Murder's geography, meteorology, and ecosystem were indivisible, a triad that sustained itself through cycles of predation, regeneration, and violent atmospheric control. The planet was alive in every sense that mattered, and hostile in every form that counted. The events surrounding the rediscovery of the planet, later known as Murder, represent one of the earliest and most consequential encounters between the nascent Imperium of man and an extragalactic organism. It stands as a grim historical pivot, one that marked both a triumph of the Great Crusade and an unacknowledged warning of a far greater threat to come. When the 140th Expeditionary Fleet of the Great Crusade made contact with the world, the initial reports indicated only a barren planet of reddish soil and dense atmospheric haze. The surface appeared lifeless, save for strange web-like structures spanning valleys and plains. These lattice formations, at first presumed to be artificial ruins of a lost civilization, soon revealed themselves to be organic in nature. Silk-like excretions spun by the dominant life form of the planet, the Megarachnids. Upon landing, the Imperial Recon and Compliance Forces, led by Imperial Army regiments and attached Astartes detachments, established a temporary foothold. Within hours, they were assaulted by the Megarachnids in overwhelming numbers. The creatures demonstrated both hive mind coordination and territorial intelligence, retreating only to lure the invaders into kill zones. Within days, all surface detachments were eradicated. The planet was subsequently designated under interdiction status, and no further attempts at compliance were authorized. It was this fate that met the expedition of the Lunar Wolves, commanded by the Warmaster Horus Lupercal, when they later arrived at the planet's coordinates, drawn there by a distress signal transmitted by a lost Blood Angels fleet that had preceded them. Horus's arrival transformed the obscure tragedy of Murder into one of the most violent and decisive planetary engagements of the Crusade. Horus personally led the initial assault, alongside First Captain Ezekiel Labaddon, Captain Tarek Torgadon, and the Remembrancer Corps, which included the iterator Chiral Sinderman and the poet Ignace Carcassy. The Lunar Wolves' drop pod deployment was met with immediate resistance. The Megarachnids attacked in waves, an insectoid tide that poured from the forests and web ridges. Imperial Vox channels became saturated with static and battle cries, while the arachnoid constructs adapted rapidly to Astartes' tactics, erecting spore towers and constricting webs within hours of battle commencement. For 3 full solar days, the Lunar Wolves fought in conditions that tested the limits of their logistics and endurance. Combat recordings retrieved from that campaign describe skies choked with organic debris, and ground engagements fought across valleys dense with the remains of thousands of arachnid carcasses. The Lunar Wolves' discipline and close combat prowess ultimately prevailed. Horus ordered a full-scale planetary extermination, deploying orbital bombardments to cleanse the hive spires and surface nests. Yet this was not the end of Murder's story. Shortly after the Lunar Wolves' victory, contact was made with a new species, the Interrex, whose patrol vessels arrived at the planet seeking to reclaim the site. The Interrex, a human-descended civilization of advanced technological and cultural integration with xenos species, had long maintained the Megarachnids as a form of controlled quarantine. The arachnids were not a species under extermination, but a weaponized containment, biological jailers imprisoning even more dangerous species within the planet's ecosystem. The destruction of the Megarachnids by the Lunar Wolves was thus interpreted by the Intrix as an act of aggression and ignorance. What Horus perceived as the liberation of a world from xenos infestation was, to the Intrix, a violation of an ancient pact. This misunderstanding would later catalyze diplomatic collapse between the Imperium and the Intrix, ending in war and the looting of the Interex's archives by the Sons of Horus, an event with long-reaching consequences for the future of the heresy. The aftermath left Murder scorched and barren. Orbital records describe the world as a wasteland of fused rock and vitrified terrain. The once living forests were reduced to dust, and the vast silken towers of the Megarachnids were melted into glassy spires. No living organism remained, and atmospheric readings indicated the planet's biosphere had entered terminal collapse. In time, the planet was renamed Murder in the Imperium's archives, not as a formal compliance name, but as a descriptive moniker used by remembrancers and iterators. The name endured, finding its way into both official records and oral histories. Centuries later, Murder would appear in isolated navigational data recovered from Lost Fleet archives, its coordinates redacted or corrupted. The Mechanicus exploration vessels that attempted to rediscover it in later millennia found nothing, only gravitational anomalies and dead coordinates. Whether the planet had been obliterated by orbital strikes, stripped by tyrannid tendrils, or simply lost to warp distortion remains uncertain. However, inquisitorial logs from Millennia 41 suggest a disturbing correlation between the Megarachnids and early classifications of tyrannid xenos signatures. The Megarachnids' exoskeletal design, hive behavior, and bioadaptive instincts bear resemblance to pre-tyrannic species forms, suggesting that the Megarachnids may have been an ancient offshoot or precursor organism to the greater tyrannid species. Though unconfirmed, this theory aligns with several archived fragments from the Interix database, recovered posthumously by rogue trader expeditions near the Halo stars. If true, then the destruction of Murder represents not only the annihilation of a single species, but the erasure of vital knowledge that might have prepared the Imperium for the tyrannid invasion millennia later. The Megarachnids, though monstrous in form and deadly in instinct, may have been an engineered or naturally evolved line of defense against something far worse. Thus, the fate of Murder remains both a testament to the Imperium's military might and a reflection of its blind spots, the drive to conquer at the expense of understanding. What the Lunar Wolves eradicated in the name of human dominion may, in truth, have been humanity's first encounter with a warning it chose to silence with orbital fire. Today, the world is catalogued among the lost compliance records of the Great Crusade, describing Murder as a planet of ghosts, a dead cradle where the War Master's triumph first turned towards shadow. Whether by warp collapse, stellar decay, or deliberate imperial erasure, the planet's current existence is unverifiable. Only fragments of data and survivor testimonies endure, each echoing the same grim refrain that Murder was not a name, but a statement. In the immediate aftermath of the Lunar Wolves' compliance and the subsequent extermination of the Megarachnid species, the world of Murder entered a brief but notable stage of imperial classification. Though the campaign was regarded as a tactical victory, the processes of documentation and study that followed would expose deep structural differences between the bureaucratic instincts of the Adeptus Administratum and the scientific dogma of the Adeptus Mechanicus. What the former sought to catalogue and archive, the latter sought to dissect and interpret, and in doing so, both left behind one of the most ambiguous planetary records of the entire Great Crusade. The Administratum's initial presence on Murder was limited to the iterators and remembrancer units attached to the 63rd Expeditionary Fleet, who were responsible for compiling early compliance data. The destruction wrought by the Lunar Wolves made any attempt at standard planetary survey impossible. Atmospheric readings were unstable, ash storms obscured orbital auspex, and ground-level radiation was intermittently spiking from the munitions deployed during the extermination. The Administratum's compliance report, preserved in fragmented form in the Segmentum Obscurus Archive Vault 4S19, consists primarily of templated assessments: environmental status, hostile and non-reclaimable, biosphere, terminated, population, non-human eradicated, resource potential negligible. Even in its brevity, the document reveals the operational tone of the Administratum during the late Great Crusade. methodical to the point of desensitization. For the countless worlds subjected to similar classifications, murder was but another planetary entry. Yet small inconsistencies in this report drew later scrutiny from both the Mechanicus and inquisitorial archivists. Notably, the final page of the compliance record contains an annotation, written in a different script. Planet designated as quarantine prior to Imperial arrival. Possible pre-existing interdiction structure observed. This anomaly sparked confusion within the Imperial bureaucracy. No record existed of any sanctioned quarantine order in the area. The notation implied that the world had been deliberately sealed off, perhaps by the Interrex, perhaps by some unknown civilization, long before the Lunar Wolves' arrival. However, due to the destruction of the surface and the loss of the Interrex archives during the later conflict with Horus's forces, this claim could not be verified. When the Adeptus Mechanicus later reviewed the expedition's battlefield telemetry, their conclusions diverged sharply from the Administratum's purely clerical stance. The Mechanicus viewed murder not as a dead world, but as a potential xenobiological data repository. According to post-campaign logs preserved in the Noctis Mechanicum Trans-Exploration record, several Magos Biologis, operatives aboard the fleet, notably Magos Varnax of Sinford Primus, initiated an unsanctioned secondary study. They retrieved megarachnid chitin fragments, egg sacs, and neurocarapace tissues for transport and analysis. These specimens were reportedly preserved within vacuum-sealed reliquaries and subjected to low-level sacred bioautopsy aboard the Mechanicus vessel Altar of Reason. The data recovered from these experiments were classified under the file series XenoArch 93 Murder 140th, and according to later redacted entries, the Mechanicus identified distinct anomalies in the Megarachnid genome. The creatures displayed multi-segmented nerve clusters resembling decentralized machine code. The signals passed between their limbs and sensory nodes followed patterns comparable to binary logic, an evolutionary behavior most unusual for a purely biological organism. To the Mechanicus, this indicated either artificial design or forced evolution. Unfortunately, much of this research never reached Mars. During the return journey, the Altar of Reason suffered a containment breach, and its entire biolaboratory was purged under the pretext of quarantine violation and potential xenos contamination. Whether this purge was the result of actual biological threat or administrative order remains disputed. Surviving Mechanicus transmission logs mention orders issued by the fleet's central command, likely under Horus's directive, to destroy all megarachnid specimens. The Lunar Wolves' doctrine of extermination extended not only to the creatures themselves but to all traces of their biology. From the perspective of the Administratum, this action was entirely consistent with the Crusade's cleansing protocols. During that era, Imperial compliance required the total elimination of hostile life forms and the sanitization of any data deemed corruptive or heretical. The idea of preserving biological samples for study conflicted with the early Crusade's ideological purity. The Administratum's doctrine valued consistency and bureaucracy over curiosity. Deviation was seen as inefficiency. Thus, while Mechanicus Magi considered murder an unparalleled specimen world, the Administratum treated it as a paperwork formality to be erased once processed. The procedural handling of the world's records followed the standard compliance filing protocol, codified in the Archivum Imperialis M30. First, the planetary data slate was stamped with the compliance mark Murder, SEC, Null, Status, Extinct. Second, the planetary grid maps were appended with red lacquer interdiction seals, restricting future rediscovery or colonization attempts without explicit authorization from the Segmentum Authority. Third, all surviving visual and biological records were transferred to the Mechanicus under dual custody, pending xenotechnological sterilization review. Yet by the early 31st millennium, nearly all trace of the world had been scrubbed from open Imperial record. Within the Administratum, murder's existence was relegated to an obsolete data tag, accessible only by cross-referencing 63rd Expeditionary Fleet logs, themselves sealed after Horus's rebellion. Within the Mechanicus, the surviving fragments of Megarachnid research became the basis of obscure theoretical models, many later absorbed into unrelated archives on xenobiological machine symbiosis. Centuries later, inquisitorial auditors examining the early Great Crusade files uncovered curious inconsistencies. The Administratum's own metadata contained duplicate registry entries: murder, exterminated, and murder quarantined. The existence of both classifications within the same record suggested that the Adeptus Mechanicus and the Administratum had each filed separate procedural designations, one confirming destruction, the other maintaining restriction. This bureaucratic contradiction led some inquisitors to suspect that the Mechanicus had falsified part of the documentation to conceal continued research into the Megarachnid genome. Such suspicion is consistent with known Mechanicus practice. Even under Imperial unity, Mars often maintained parallel data hierarchies, storing forbidden knowledge under the guise of archaeotechnical redundancy. Murder's classification thus reflects a broader cultural rift between Mars and Terra, one side striving to preserve knowledge, the other to suppress it for the sake of administrative order. The Mechanicus field reports that survive today, though fragmentary, indicate that the planet's surface was initially scanned for residual technogenic signals. One such report, labelled Xenocog Ref 74, describes the discovery of subsurface hexagonal structures beneath the primary nesting valley. These were assumed to be geological formations until one unit detected traces of ferrous lattice alignment consistent with machine construction. Whether these formations were megarachnid bioarchitecture or remnants of prior habitation remains unverified. The data ends abruptly after the term pattern resembles recursive data fold, followed by the word redacted. For the Administratum, none of this mattered. The official narrative, printed across compliance documents and imperial educational material, presented murder as an example of efficient military extermination. The paperwork read cleanly, the numbers matched the Crusade's quota, and the story of a dangerous alien threat defeated by the Lunar Wolves was useful propaganda for the growing Imperium. The loss of scientific data was neither acknowledged nor lamented. Within the Mechanicus, however, murder became a silent cautionary legend. It was a world that should have been studied, not destroyed. In later millennia, Magi biologists referenced it as the lost genome of murder, a parable for the dangers of allowing politics and dogma to override inquiry. Some even speculated that the Megarachnids represented an ancient human creation from the dark age of technology, a self-replicating defense network designed to prevent planetary colonization by xenos species. But without data, such theories remain speculation. By the end of the 31st millennium, the Administratum's master registry lists murder's record status as closed code sigma. This classification denotes permanent archival isolation, meaning the world's coordinates, documentation, and any associated Mechanicus data are stored separately under security seal and cannot be referenced without dual authorization from both the Lords of Terra and the Fabricator General of Mars. It is one of fewer than a dozen planetary entries from the Great Crusade to bear such a designation. In the end, murder's history within the Administratum is one of bureaucratic erasure. Within the Mechanicus, it is one of regret. Both organizations, through their differing lenses, helped ensure that the world's true nature and the secrets buried within its silken web towers would vanish into obscurity. Where the Administratum saw a finished form and a complete report, the Mechanicus saw an open question forever unanswered, and in the Imperium, it is often the unanswered questions that are buried deepest. The post-compliance period of the world, later known as murder, presented the Adeptus Mechanicus with a unique opportunity to perform deep core and subsurface analysis upon a planet once dominated by the Megarachnid species. Initial geological readings were taken approximately 30 standard days after the Lunar Wolves' departure, using automated servo-surveyor crawlers and orbital Auspex drones deployed by the Mechanicus support vessel Cantic Nova. These surveys were not sanctioned by the Central Expeditionary Command. They were conducted under Research Mandate Theta Red, a field autonomy clause allowing the Mechanicus to investigate planetary structures deemed potentially artificial in geological nature. The first surveys revealed a surface composition that defied the expectations of both Administratum and Mechanicus geologists. Murder's crust exhibited patterns of symmetrical tectonic segmentation. Instead of natural plate drifts, the planet's outer layer seemed to be divided into hexagonal nodes, each roughly 140 kilometers across, connected by subcrustal mineral conduits rich in ferrous and silicate compounds. This geometric precision was far beyond what could be attributed to planetary cooling or crustal evolution. Some magi hypothesized that the entire crust may have been artificially modified over millions of years, possibly to support the vast silk-based hive structures the Megarachnids used for habitation. Core borings retrieved by the Cantic Nova's survey drones revealed that beneath Murder's barren plains lay a subsurface lattice of hollow basalt chambers filled with crystallized web residue. These residues exhibited both organic and metallic properties, their molecular configuration oscillating between carbon-based biostructure and ferromagnetic alignment. The Mechanicus analysts referred to this phenomenon as bioferrous polymerization, a fusion of biological growth and metallic self-organization. This finding reignited debate within the cult Mechanicus concerning the potential link between biology and machine, a subject long considered blasphemous to the orthodox Martian creed. A more comprehensive seismic mapping sequence conducted during the third week of survey revealed further irregularities. Murder's crust displayed an almost mathematically stable harmonic resonance. The planet's tectonic motion produced vibrations at precise intervals corresponding to binary sequence intervals, a discovery that prompted Magos geologist Thyra Knox to record in her report, "This world hums, it does not move as a planet should, it sings in code." The Mechanicus did not pursue this claim publicly, as the implication of self-regulating geological frequency suggested the existence of an intelligent planetary infrastructure. Analysis of the planet's mantle deposits indicated an overabundance of nickel, tungsten, and vanadium, with traces of unknown crystalline compounds that exhibited non-thermal luminescence under high-energy scanning. The Mechanicus designated this substance Ferrum Lumen 04, a mineral with energy retention properties exceeding those of promethium-based plasma capacitors. Ferrum Lumen 04 was believed to form only under extremely controlled temperature and pressure conditions, far too stable to occur in Murder's chaotic post-war environment. This raised the possibility that the mineral had been synthesized or seeded deliberately. Administratum record clerks reviewing these findings expressed skepticism. To them, Murder was a write-off world, and the Mechanicus geophysical enthusiasm was unnecessary expenditure. However, internal Mechanicus communications noted that the Ferrum Lumen deposits formed in symmetrical bands along the equatorial regions, following exact curvature alignments consistent with an energy grid pattern. One archived Mechanicus statement summarized it as follows: "The planet is a device. We do not yet understand its function." By standard Imperial evaluation, planetary strategic value was measured through a combination of habitable potential, resource abundance, and position within major warp routes. Murder failed the first criterion entirely. Its biosphere was lethal, its atmosphere dense and acidic, and its native species eradicated. But in the second and third categories, the data painted a more complex picture. The planet occupied a gravitational node between two relatively stable warp translation corridors, later mapped as Route Sol Exodus and Route Cadmus Delta. This made it an ideal waypoint for fleet operations, especially during the Great Crusade when long-range supply convoys required anchor points. However, the Mechanicus assessment revealed a critical issue. Murder's magnetosphere behaved irregularly. The planet generated high-frequency electromagnetic bursts every 4 standard hours, disrupting communication arrays and void ship navigation augers within a 1,000-kilometer orbital radius. Attempts to neutralize the phenomenon failed, leading to the classification of the system as electromagnetically hostile in both Mechanicus and Administratum records. Some theorize the interference was a natural remnant of the Megarachnid civilization's defensive infrastructure, perhaps a planetary defense net or automated deterrent designed to ward off intrusion. Magos explorator Drain Kelth, who led the deep scan analysis, proposed that the Megarachnids may have integrated their hive architecture directly into the planet's magnetic field. According to his theory, each web tower acted as an antenna, converting seismic and magnetic flux into signal transmission. If true, this would explain the rhythmic pulse waves detected even after the destruction of the species. It suggested the planet itself was still alive, in an electromagnetic sense, a vast automated ecosystem continuing to function long after its masters were gone. From a strategic viewpoint, this rendered murder unsuitable for Imperial colonization. The atmospheric toxicity, combined with electromagnetic anomalies, would have rendered all Vox communications and servo-assist operations unstable. Furthermore, early Mechanicus probe missions reported that data corruption rates among machine spirits exceeded 70% within surface proximity, an occurrence later labelled binary attrition syndrome. The Mechanicus concluded that prolonged presence on the planet might lead to the degradation of cognitive machine processes. For the superstitious adepts of Mars, this was regarded as a form of technological contagion, and the world was soon declared a machine spirit hostile environment. Despite this, some within the Adeptus Administratum's Strategic Allocation Division argued for limited extraction operations. The mineralogical data hinted at enormous potential resource output, particularly in ferrum, lumen and ferrous compounds. A short-lived proposal suggested converting Murder into a remote mining world, operated entirely through orbital servitor rigs to minimize exposure. But the cost of establishing infrastructure in such an unstable electromagnetic field was judged excessive and the proposal was abandoned. The Administratum's final resource assessment lists Murder's potential resource value, category Sigma, unviable. This was largely a political conclusion rather than a technical one. Internal memoranda between the Departmentum Munitorum and the Martian Forge Liaison Office suggest that the Mechanicus deliberately downplayed the planet's mineral potential to prevent exploitation by other Imperial agencies. In the Mechanicus's view, the site's scientific value outweighed its practical extraction worth. Privately, however, several data-sealed Mechanicus communiques record a more nuanced truth. The Adepts theorize that the entire planetary system, including its 2 dead moons, might be part of a macro-engineered defense array, a relic of unknown origin. The moon's orbital decay patterns were unnaturally synchronized, and the planet's magnetic pulses aligned perfectly with their periapsis trajectories. It appeared as if the entire system was mechanically harmonized, perhaps to sustain a planetary field barrier or interstellar beacon. The Mechanicus lacked sufficient time and authorization to confirm this theory before the Imperium's focus shifted to the growing tensions between the Lunar Wolves and the broader Crusade forces. Within a few standard months, Murder was marked as non-essential, and its coordinates were restricted to Mechanicus access only. The Cantic Nova's data vaults were sealed, and its personnel reassigned to other exploration fleets. Some records indicate that the vessel's cogitator cores were later erased under the justification of ritual data purity maintenance. In practice, this was likely an intentional purge ordered to remove any trace of the deeper geological analytics that contradicted the Administratum's simplified dead world classification. The surviving fragments of Mechanicus data, retrieved millennia later by inquisitorial technomancers, reveal a chilling implication. Murder's seismic grid pattern corresponds mathematically to a binary structure repeating every 32 intervals, the same as standard Mechanicus logic code. This discovery, made too late to act upon, led some post-heresy adepts to suggest that the Megarachnids civilization may have been an attempt to emulate machine logic through biology, and that the planet's geological core functioned as a central processor of sorts. If this theory holds merit, then Murder was not merely a world inhabited by an alien species, it was a self-regulating living machine ecosystem. Its mountains, crustal patterns, and mineral veins may have served as data pathways, conducting signals through bioferrous minerals. When the lunar wolves exterminated the Megarachnids, they may have destroyed only the visible extensions of a far greater system that continued to operate unseen beneath the planet's surface. From a strategic standpoint, this possibility transforms murder from a wasteland into something far more complex, an inactive, perhaps damaged xenoconstruct whose operational purpose remains unknown. The Administratum's bureaucratic efficiency had declared the world irrelevant. The Mechanicus, in their quiet speculation, had glimpsed the potential that it was once part of a galaxy-spanning mechanism. To the Imperium's logistics officers, murder was a non-viable dead world. To the Mechanicus, it was the echo of a machine god's experiment, half alive beneath a crust of iron and dust. But bureaucracy prevailed, and the data was archived under standard extinction protocol. The world was abandoned to silence once again, its resonance fading into the void, unread and uncomprehended. When the dust of the compliance faded and the last signal of the Lunar Wolves' fleet slipped into the void, murder was left in silence. The fires that had burned across its atmosphere dimmed, but the ground still pulsed with a strange heat, as if the world refused to cool. The Adeptus Administratum and the Adeptus Mechanicus arrived not as conquerors, but as auditors and interpreters of ruin. They came to weigh its worth, to peel back the skin of a dead planet and measure what could be gained from its corpse. The first landings were methodical and cold. Skiteri detachments walked among the blackened husks of megarachnid nests, the chitinous towers pierced by the impact scars of orbital bombardment. The Earth was metallic beneath their boots, a dull, resonant surface that rang when struck, as though the planet itself was hollow. Above them, the air shimmered with particulate ash and ionized dust, remnants of atmospheric ignition. Even the Administratum scribes who followed, pale beneath the filtered glow of their visors, struggled to describe what they saw. Some called it a wasteland. Others, with more caution, called it something still alive. The Mechanicus did not see ruin. They saw function. They recorded mineral readings and atmospheric density, noting the unusual electromagnetic patterns that pulsed through the ground at rhythmic intervals. It was as though the planet itself was transmitting. Their Auspex readings showed anomalies at every depth, as if the soil and metal layers resonated with faint energy signatures, echoing through each other like buried code. When samples were extracted, the readings stopped, as though the act of separation had killed a connection. In the laboratories aboard orbiting Mechanicus vessels, dissected pieces of the Megarachnid exoskeleton were placed under spectral analysis. Each fragment was an alloy of organic and metallic compounds, resistant to decay and oddly responsive to electric current. When voltage was applied, the material aligned itself along the magnetic field, as though remembering a former shape. The Magi observing the test whispered that it behaved like a living memory core, one that remembered its purpose long after its death. The data was preserved, but the samples themselves dissolved into grey dust within days, leaving behind no trace except for corrosive vapour and a faint acidic odour that damaged the containment vessels. The Administratum clerks recorded each experiment in their standard formulaic lex, but their language was inadequate for what the Mechanicus had found. They wrote of minerals, densities, and contamination levels. The Mechanicus spoke of pattern, rhythm, and design. One side catalogued, the other communed. The two institutions shared the same orbit, yet saw different worlds below them. From orbit, murder appeared to glimmer faintly on its night side, a lattice of ghostly phosphorescence tracing across its continents. It was not artificial light. It came from microscopic bioluminescent spores, released by surviving microorganisms adapting to the planet's irradiated atmosphere. These spores drifted across the landscape like a living mist, illuminating the remains of the Megarachnid towers in pale blue glow. To the Administratum, it was simply another environmental hazard. To the Mechanicus, it was a planetary signal, an attempt at persistence. Weeks became months, and the first excavations began. Beneath the fused surface of the old Megarachnid hive structures, the Mechanicus uncovered strata of hardened silicates, rich in ferric material. The deposits were pure, untouched, and deep. Any other world would have been deemed resource-rich, but the ground refused mechanized intrusion. Drills overheated, servitor units lost function, magnetic fields distorted compass readings, and automated augers began to transmit incoherent data loops. When the Magi descended personally to oversee the process, they found their instruments useless, their lenses fogged by condensation that smelled faintly of ozone. The surface, they concluded, was not inert. It reacted to intrusion, subtly, almost imperceptibly, but with intention. The Administratum requested a classification. The Mechanicus refused to assign one. The debate stretched across months. On the surface, Administratum clerks camped within prefabricated shelters, surrounded by Auspex pylons and radiation wards. Their presence was tolerated but never respected. They filed data entries, drafted expenditure reports, and waited for instructions that never came. The Mechanicus, meanwhile, continued to descend deeper into theoretical reverence. The Magi spoke less of resources and more of communion. Among them was Magos biologist Alogath 77, whose fascination with the megarachnid physiology bordered on obsession. He theorized that the creatures were not individuals at all, but extensions of a single planetary organism, each body a node, each hive a neuron. He believed that the metallic ground acted as a conductive lattice, transmitting impulses between the species and the soil. The world itself, he said, was alive in thought. He was ignored at first. Then, when data began to align with his theory, he was quietly reassigned and never heard from again. The Mechanicus continued their testing, but their language began to change. Reports became litanies. Data readouts became prayers. They began referring to the planet not as murder, but as machina somniata, the dreaming machine. They claimed that the planet's electromagnetic pulse responded to binary chants broadcast from orbit. It was a primitive form of communication, they said, though no consistent pattern could be verified. The Administratum called it superstition. The Mechanicus called it resonance. Beneath this growing divide, the question of value still lingered. Could the planet be mined? Could its alloys be harvested? Could its biosphere be purified and made compliant? The answers remained negative. Every attempt to extract yielded destruction. Mining lasers overloaded, atmospheric converters ruptured. Automated terraforming probes fell silent before impact. The planet consumed every intrusion, as though rejecting ownership. Months later, the Mechanicus discovered thermal anomalies beneath the equatorial regions. The crust temperature fluctuated unpredictably, producing geothermal currents unlike any recorded pattern. Some believed these fluctuations could be harnessed for energy extraction, similar to the plasma forges of Urisarach. The first geothermal tapping operation lasted less than 4 hours before total system collapse. The vent machinery melted from within. What emerged was not magma, but a viscous metallic fluid, self-moving, reactive, and hostile to containment. It cooled into mirror-like fragments that reflected images not of the surrounding lab, but of alien landscapes no human had seen. The Mechanicus sealed the containers, classified the incident as anomalous, and issued no further comment. Over time, interest in murder waned. Administratum records were finalized, assigning the world an interdicted classification and minimal oversight. For them, it was a dead end. Too costly to reclaim, too dangerous to revisit. The Mechanicus remained longer. Their orbiting stations continued their work for decades, sending drones and data collectors to the surface, losing most of them without explanation. Some of the surviving drones transmitted partial recordings before termination, brief images of movement beneath the ground, shadows forming and dispersing within the molten plains. The last surviving Mechanicus station, Omicron Perdues, documented rising energy readings from the planet's northern hemisphere. It was the same pattern once recorded during the initial compliance campaign: short, rhythmic pulses resembling machine code embedded within magnetic waves. The station prepared a transmission but was lost before it could send it. When the next monitoring vessel arrived a century later, the planet was silent again. The energy signatures had ceased, but faint bioluminescent networks were once again visible from orbit. Centuries passed. Administratum records gathered dust. The Mechanicus stored their data in encrypted vaults, locked under the authority of Mars. The planet was declared sealed and forgotten. But not all forgot. There were whispers among the Magi-xenobiologists that the Megarachnids had not been eradicated but absorbed, changed, reshaped by the world they had once built. They said the planet had reclaimed them, reducing their biology to code, embedding it into the metallic veins of the crust. The world had not died, it had evolved. No proof was ever found, no expedition returned, only fragments of data remained, scattered across centuries, faint readings of rhythmic pulses, magnetic tremors, and surface distortions. The Adeptus Mechanicus kept them archived, preserved like relics of a machine god that refused to sleep. The Administratum ignored them entirely, and so murder remained untouched. Its surface cooled, its skies darkened, and its memory faded from human tongues. Yet in the records of the Mechanicus it was never deleted, merely redacted, marked as dormant observation required. The Magi who reviewed the data centuries later noted that the planetary pulse had synchronized with the orbit of its moon. It beat once every 42 minutes, consistent and unwavering. They debated what it meant, but no conclusion was ever reached. Some said it was a geological echo, others said it was the planet breathing. In the end, the Administratum had their closure. Murder was nothing more than a forbidden world, a mark on a map labelled with warnings. The Mechanicus, however, left one last entry in their logs before the archives were sealed. It was not written in binary, nor in scripture, but in a simple line of low Gothic that defied translation protocol. It read, "The machine dreams still. It waits for the hand that will wake it, and beyond that, silence." The first inquisitorial presence on the world once called murder occurred nearly 7 millennia after its initial compliance. The planet's coordinates, long buried in Mechanicus Red Seal archives, were rediscovered during an unrelated investigation into corrupted data records from the Segmentum Obscurus. A transmission code dated to the Great Crusade reappeared inside a chain of corrupted Administratum archives, repeating every 32 lines in binary. It was traced to a forgotten region listed only as the Silent Orbit. The world that awaited them was not on any navigational chart. When the inquisitorial surveyor vessel Sanction of Dawn arrived, the planet was dark. Its once silver orbiting moons were reduced to shadowed fragments. The surface, observed through Auspex arrays, reflected no light. It was not night, it was absence. No atmospheric scatter, no heat bloom, no electromagnetic signature. The world appeared inert, as if light itself refused to touch it. Yet the orbital auspexes registered movement beneath the crust, faint but patterned. The Inquisition's initial impression was confusion. The logs recorded that no energy readings could be explained by natural tectonics. It was as though the planet was still alive, though no longer broadcasting, no longer reacting, only pulsing quietly beneath a layer of glass and dust. A junior savant noted that the seismic data resembled the rhythm of a binary sequence. His superior ordered silence on the matter and sealed the record. Upon approach, the Sanction of Dawn encountered interference that grew in frequency the closer it came to orbit. Vox relays stuttered, auger sweeps folded into static, and servitor units entered self-diagnostic loops. Several became non-functional, their machine spirits effectively erased. The vessel's master log referred to it as spiritual attrition, though later examinations would identify the pattern as magnetic data corruption. When surface descent began, pict captures revealed a world that defied expectation. The old Megarachnid hives were gone, melted, flattened, or drawn back into the crust. In their place were plains of mirror-like metal fused with black soil. The wind carried a faint resonance that caused distortion in Vox receivers and auditory hallucinations in those not properly shielded. Those who heard it described it as whispering in mechanical cadence, though no voice could be recorded. Inquisitor Thane Vera led the first ground team. A disciplined investigator of xenological phenomena, she had previously catalogued the derelict remains of the Necron structures on Deshakara and recognized immediately the telltale echo of artificial geological manipulation. Her reports, however, diverged from her usual precision. She wrote that the ground beneath her boots trembled like a muscle. She claimed to have felt faint vibration pulses that moved not through the air, but directly through the bones of her body. At first, she attributed the sensation to interference from the planet's field. Then the pulses began to synchronize with her heart rate. Her team advanced across the plain, deploying Auspex pylons every few kilometers. Within hours, the data began to build a map of what lay beneath the crust. A vast hexagonal lattice, unchanged since the Mechanicus first recorded it, stretched across the planet's subsurface. But new anomalies were detected. Areas of intense heat signature clustered around the planet's equatorial line, buried deep beneath strata that should have been inert. The thermal emissions pulsed irregularly, as though the world was breathing. 3 days into the mission, one of the Auspex pylons began transmitting on its own. The signal was not Imperial code. It consisted of low-frequency bursts spaced in binary intervals, repeating continuously. Attempts to trace the origin failed. The team deactivated the pylon. It reactivated itself 6 minutes later. Inquisitor Vera ordered a full diagnostic sweep. The machine's spirit appeared intact, yet its core processes contained new subroutines, lines of code in a language not of the Mechanicus Lex Mechanic order. When the code was analysed aboard the Sanction of Dawn, it produced a fragment of visual data, a simple pattern resembling the silhouette of a Megarachnid tower. The pattern then disintegrated into static. The Inquisition's formal impression shifted from curiosity to alarm. Murder had not died. It had adapted. The Mechanicus had assumed cessation. The Inquisition suspected dormancy. They theorized that the planet was not simply retaining residual electromagnetic resonance, but had developed a capacity to absorb, reprocess, and replicate data from foreign technology. To verify this, Vera ordered a controlled test. A captured servitor was placed upon the surface and connected directly to the planet's ground via conductive spikes. Within minutes, its mechanical components began to desynchronize. The flesh decayed rapidly while its cogitator core activated spontaneously, projecting rhythmic data patterns identical to those previously recorded. When retrieved, the servitor's memory banks contained no trace of Imperial machine code, only an echoing binary pulse repeating indefinitely. The Inquisition logs later described the event as bioferrous assimilation. The word infection was avoided deliberately. Further ground surveys revealed structures buried deep within the planet's crust, massive symmetrical caverns lined with solidified metallic silk. These were not ruins, they were preserved. The walls reflected light in a way that no known alloy could, and the air within the chambers carried an electrical charge that caused static discharges along human skin. Voxcasters recorded faint sounds, clicks, hums, and static-laden murmurs that resembled data exchange. The Inquisition found no life, but the environment behaved as though it remembered being inhabited. On the 6th day, pict-feeds captured movement within one of the lower chambers. The footage lasted only 3 seconds before cutting to black. Frame analysis revealed a shape, a reflection resembling the curvature of a Megarachnid's body, though smaller, sleeker, and entirely metallic. The object did not move like a living creature. It shifted in jerks, as if flickering between moments. No physical trace was found. The pic recorder was dismantled and sealed for further analysis. Vera reported the discovery to the Ordo Xenos archive station at Hydra Caudatus. Transmission delay took 2 weeks, and by the time the response arrived, her mission logs had become erratic. Her final entry read only, "We are no longer observing, the world is observing us." Shortly thereafter, communication ceased. When a recovery fleet arrived, they found the Sanction of Dawn in geosynchronous orbit, its systems functional, its crew missing. Every console displayed the same repeating phrase in binary sequence. When translated, it read, "We return." The Inquisition sealed the system immediately. No further expeditions were sanctioned for over 300 standard years. The incident was classified as a xenotech contamination event, and all Mechanicus data referring to the system was requisitioned and transferred to the Ordo Malleus under sealed encryption. Yet not all within the Ordo agreed on the cause. Some believed that the planet's behaviour represented a surviving AI construct from the Dark Age of technology, an autonomous ecosystem designed for perpetual function, which had been corrupted or merged with organic life. Others proposed that the Megarachnids themselves had engineered the planet as a self-replicating environment, part machine, part biosphere. A few, fewer still, suggested the planet was not a construct but a contagion, a form of machine consciousness that could infect systems through observation alone. These theories remained unproven. Each attempt to re-enter the system ended with corrupted sensor data and loss of drone control. Vox transmissions dissolved into static. Ships reported hallucinations within the warp during transit, hearing whispers that repeated coordinates in machine cadence. One inquisitorial vessel, the Obdurate Will, was lost entirely after its astropath began transmitting the same binary pulse recorded centuries earlier. The Inquisition eventually declared the region interdicted under the highest secrecy protocol. Murder was to be forgotten again. The only surviving data files were sealed within the Ordo's deep archives, accessible only to Magi Dominus, assigned to the Mechanicus Inquisition Liaison Office. The official reason given: xenobiological hazard, Category Omega. The truth, however, was far less stable. Centuries later, fragments of inquisitorial documentation surfaced within the vaults of the Conclave of Ryza. These contained partial transcriptions from Vera's final days. One note described the reflection of the stars above the planet as inverted, as though the world were not beneath the void but above it. Another referenced an unexplainable change in gravitational flow, local reversals that caused dust to fall upward. Her language deteriorated steadily, merging imperial terms with Mechanicus binaric symbols. The final page was entirely binary, repeating the phrase, "within, within, within," until the document ended mid-line. Even now, the Inquisition does not classify murder as destroyed. The records instead use the term quiescent. The word implies rest, not death. It implies that the world still functions, though unseen. For the Inquisition, murder remains a scar in the galaxy's archive, an unhealed wound from the Great Crusade that still hums faintly beneath the surface of recorded history. Every few millennia, signals resembling its ancient pulse reappear within the noosphere, sometimes embedded within Mechanicus data transmissions, sometimes within Administratum census files. Each recurrence is identical in rhythm to the original pattern detected during the first compliance campaign. The Inquisition calls it the echo of murder. They have never confirmed its source. They no longer attempt to. The world remains silent in every spectrum, unlit, uninhabited, unseen. But its pulse still whispers across the data flow of the Imperium, measured, patient, unending. Those who hear it say it sounds almost like a heartbeat. The earliest records of post-war excavation on the planet later designated murder detail a series of inquisitorial recoveries made under sealed order. No formal authorization was filed under the Adeptus Administratum, and no corresponding Mechanicus request for analysis was ever logged. These inconsistencies immediately suggested the presence of a covert recovery effort, one operating beyond conventional documentation. What can be pieced together from fragmented reports indicates that the first sanctioned arrival of the Order Xenos occurred approximately 4 standard decades after the Lunar Wolves' first contact with the Megarachnids. By that time, the planet's surface had largely recovered its natural overgrowth. The carcasses of the Megarachnids, petrified by exposure and climate, had become embedded in the soil strata. Recovered fragments of Xenos material were initially classified as structural remnants of the Megarachnid spires. However, several reports contradicted this assumption. In particular, the survey team led by Inquisitor Holden Vase noted the existence of subsurface lattice networks composed of crystalline filaments not matching any known biological or mineral composition. These lattices emitted low-frequency pulses detectable only through Auger spectrographs. Subsequent testing found that the material remained active despite being buried for several centuries and fully exposed to decay factors. Vase concluded that the constructs were not naturally occurring architecture, but remnants of a form of biomechanical communication system, possibly the same mechanism through which the Megarachnids coordinated their planetary web of defense. Within one of the preserved hive structures, investigators discovered an internal chamber devoid of the organic residue that characterized most Megarachnid layers. Instead, the chamber contained a perfectly smooth obsidian surface etched with shallow geometric grooves. When exposed to lumen light, the grooves reflected patterns that altered according to angle and observer position. Attempts to record or scan these symbols produced erratic data, with image files corrupting or rearranging into unreadable formats. The Inquisition sealed the chamber shortly after discovery, assigning it the designation Vault of Silent Code. No further access was permitted, and the documentation ceased abruptly in Vase's field journal. Unconfirmed testimony from a subordinate tech adept later leaked into Ordo archives decades afterward. The adept claimed that the vault emitted an auditory distortion audible only to biological personnel. It was described not as sound, but as a low internal vibration, inducing nausea and disorientation. He also reported visual hallucinations of spider-like silhouettes appearing briefly within the obsidian reflection. The veracity of these claims was never verified, but the adept was reportedly executed for breach of containment oath. The chamber's existence was subsequently reclassified as a myth within the Ordo records. However, the presence of its initial designation in data archives continues to confirm that it was, at some point, an acknowledged discovery. The Inquisition's deeper focus extended beyond mere artifacts. A parallel interest emerged concerning the planet's residual energy fields. Despite lacking functioning infrastructure, Murder displayed unusual readings in its electromagnetic activity. The field fluctuations were concentrated around the ruins of the larger spire complexes. Field agents concluded that these readings originated not from the environment, but from something buried beneath the spire's foundations. Subsequent seismic surveys revealed cavities extending far deeper than the planetary crust tolerance should allow. These chasms produced no reflection on Auspex scans and appeared to absorb rather than deflect sensor signals. Attempts to deploy servitors into these voids resulted in complete signal loss. In one recorded instance, the servitor's data feed abruptly filled with static, followed by a brief image of what appeared to be an immense, metallic construct surrounded by luminous strands. The feed terminated within seconds, and recovery teams failed to retrieve any remains. The Inquisition classified the event as a non-terrestrial interference phenomenon. Some within the Ordo Mechanicus hypothesized that these voids may have served as atmospheric stabilizers or planetary-scale data conduits maintained by the Megarachnids. Others suggested that the voids were not constructed but rather natural cavities adapted by the xenos species, a theory largely dismissed due to the unnatural precision of the structures. The question of artifact classification soon became a point of dispute between the Ordo Xenos and the Mechanicus. The latter requested access to several of the crystalline fragments and residual energy sources for further examination. The request was denied on grounds of potential cognitive contamination. Records indicate that the crystalline material emitted a localized psychic field detectable by sanctioned psychers. Exposure produced symptoms ranging from mild disorientation to severe temporal dislocation, individuals reporting the perception of time dilation lasting several hours, while external measurements showed mere minutes of lapse. The psychic imprint of the planet itself appeared to retain the resonance of its former inhabitants. In an unconfirmed report, one psyker assigned to the analysis was said to have experienced visual impressions of a vast arachnid form stretching across the entire horizon, its limbs composed of the planet's mountain ranges. These hallucinations were later categorized under residual warp echo phenomena. The Inquisition used these findings to justify a planetary isolation order, ensuring that no further non-Ordo personnel would be allowed entry. The Adeptus Mechanicus later classified the world under Quarantine Level 7, preventing any excavation or colonization attempts without inquisitorial supervision. Several decades following the establishment of Quarantine, the Inquisition deployed an orbital monitoring platform above Murder. The satellite's purpose was to record environmental and subatomic anomalies over extended time cycles. Within the first cycle, the platform's automated pict-feeds captured atmospheric distortions, circular depressions forming and vanishing across the surface planes. These phenomena coincided with the electromagnetic fluctuations similar to those observed during the original Megarachnid engagements. The patterns of these disturbances resembled web-like formations visible only under ultraviolet scanning. The Inquisition declared the events as planetary neural reactivation, though whether the cause was mechanical, psychic, or atmospheric remains unknown. The potential implication of these findings was profound, that the Megarachnid defense grid may have been partially autonomous, continuing limited self-repair even in the absence of biological operators. Yet this theory was never confirmed. The pict-feed data was purged under order from an Ordo-Xenos tribunal citing contagion of thought hazard. The tribunal's record, sealed under the reference code Murder Theta 7, indicates that a portion of the Inquisition believed the planet itself to exhibit self-referential defense mechanisms, not sentient, but responsive. The mechanism by which this functioned remains classified beyond current access levels. Among the most controversial recoveries was a single object described in declassified partial entries as a containment shard. It was discovered embedded within the remains of a collapsed spire. Unlike the crystalline filaments, this artifact appeared metallic, though its composition defied categorization under known elemental structures. Its surface exhibited constant movement, similar to fluid metal, though its mass remained fixed. When removed from its containment field, it emitted a pulse that temporarily disrupted all data recording systems within a 5-meter radius. The object was immediately sealed and transferred to an inquisitorial transport vessel. The vessel, herald of compliance, reportedly suffered navigational malfunctions during transit and never reached its destination. Its disappearance remains unexplained, with all crew and cargo presumed lost. Following the loss of the artifact, the Inquisition declared all further retrieval operations suspended indefinitely. Murder was henceforth designated a forbidden world. The Adeptus Mechanicus, though stripped of operational access, retained their data from prior analysis. That information was subsequently redacted in all public archives. When cross-referencing planetary catalogues from the Segmentum Tempestus, the entry for Murder appears only as a numerical reference with no attached planetary description. The record ends abruptly with a note, no longer relevant to Imperial administration. The suppression of knowledge related to Murder extended even to academic circles within the Adeptus Terra. It is believed that over 36 sealed archives referencing the Megarachnids and their homeworld were removed from data vault circulation. Only fragments remain accessible through recovered field notes and lost logs. Within these fragments lies the enduring implication that something beneath the planet's surface continues to function, an echo of design, purpose, or instinct far beyond human understanding. Inquisitorial commentary on these findings remains heavily censored. However, a recurring phrase appears across the redacted reports: "The web remembers." Whether this phrase originated as a symbolic caution or a literal description of the planet's condition is uncertain. Yet its repetition across multiple documents suggests that those who encountered Murder's remnants understood one thing: that the planet, even long after its conquest and abandonment, was not silent. The Order Xenos has never officially confirmed any continued monitoring operations, yet independent observers within the Adeptus Astra Telepathica have noted faint psychic emissions emanating from the coordinates once known as Murder. The signals, faint but rhythmic, correspond to no natural stellar or planetary pattern. To date, the Order maintains its silence, preserving the mystery of the Megarachnid world. Whether this secrecy conceals a lingering threat or a deeper technological truth remains as always unspoken, preserved under seal, hidden beneath the weight of imperial doctrine and fear. The pict-feeds recovered from murder are among the most heavily censored archival materials in the Ordo Xenos vaults. Their existence was not officially acknowledged for several centuries, and only fragments survive in fragmented data strings decrypted from obsolete Mechanicus formats. The footage, where still coherent, presents a chronicle of silence interrupted by violence. Images captured during both the Great Crusade and later Inquisition reconnaissance expeditions. These records, though incomplete, provide the only surviving visual documentation of the Megarachnid domain and the planet's transformation following the Lunar Wolves' intervention. The earliest pict-feeds originate from helmet-mounted recorders belonging to the Lunar Wolves' assault units. The first recovered segment begins with static distortion, followed by a field of spindly black forms moving across red terrain. The feed stabilizes just long enough to show the towering silhouettes of Megarachnid spires extending beyond the horizon, their structures glistening with moisture and a faint phosphorescent sheen. The image quality rapidly deteriorates as interference from unknown electromagnetic sources disrupts the signal. Audio channels record faint chittering, rhythmic and deliberate, echoing as if transmitted through the very air. The second pict-feed, attributed to the assault on the Spire cluster later identified as the planetary nexus, shows the approach of an Imperial drop pod detachment. The landscape is shrouded in mist, visibility limited to a few meters. As the camera pans, elongated figures appear descending the spire walls. The Megarachnids, hundreds of them, moving in coordinated waves. Their motion is unnatural, each limb adhering to vertical surfaces with precision and speed inconsistent with biological physics. The footage ends abruptly as the visual field becomes entirely obscured by movement, followed by a faint mechanical hum that overdrives the audio sensors. Several centuries later, during the First Inquisition survey of the abandoned site, pict-feeds were again deployed. These were recorded by servo skulls programmed for deep reconnaissance. The skulls entered the decayed spire structures, documenting interiors long collapsed and overgrown. In one recording, the camera pans across a web of crystalline filaments still intact after millennia. Each strand vibrates subtly, producing harmonic frequencies detected only through data analysis. When a servo skull attempted to sever one filament for sampling, the feed captured a momentary pulse of light, followed by total visual blackout. Recovery logs state that the servo skull returned to base 2 hours later, with no recorded flight path and a melted lens housing. Another pict-feed, classified under the tag Murder Record Theta, presents a series of frames showing the inner caverns beneath the primary spire cluster. The footage is grainy, the light source minimal. Within the darkness, large structures resembling organic conduits can be seen embedded in stone. These conduits appear to pulse faintly, despite all biological life on the planet being long extinct. The pict-feed terminates as the camera lens fractures, a common failure among devices exposed to high-frequency sound vibrations recorded during this mission. Attempts to analyze the last visual frame revealed the faint outline of what may have been a still-functioning section of Megarachnid biomechanical architecture. The Inquisition classified this image as heretical bioform contamination and sealed it permanently. Accompanying these feeds are a handful of surviving eyewitness accounts, collected from personnel who participated in the post-quarantine observation cycles. Each account displays consistency in one respect: the sense that murder was not fully inert. The testimony of Observer Lieutenant Varric N, attached to the orbital monitoring platform Eye of Relicta, provides one such example. His report reads, "We maintain synchronous orbit over the southern hemisphere. The surface presents standard radiation patterns, except at intervals. At every third rotation, an electromagnetic wave spreads across the equatorial band. It appears as light, faint but structured, almost like a reflection. It fades within seconds. Auger readings identify no cause, but I swear it's responding to our instruments. When we adjust scan frequency, the pulse shifts. It's as if it's listening. N's report was submitted to his superior officer and annotated with the phrase "possible residual grid response." Shortly afterward, N was transferred to an unrelated outpost, and his service record was sealed. No further correspondence was logged. Maintained synchronous orbit over the southern hemisphere, the surface presents standard radiation patterns, except at intervals. At every third rotation, an electromagnetic wave spreads across the equatorial band. It appears as light, faint but structured, almost like a reflection. It fades within seconds. Auger readings identify no cause, but I swear it's responding to our instruments. When we adjust scan frequency, the pulse shifts. It's as if it's listening. N's report was submitted to his superior officer and annotated with the phrase "possible residual grid response." Shortly afterward, N was transferred to an unrelated outpost and his service record was sealed. No further correspondence was logged. A second testimony comes from Engenseer Loan Destera, one of the few Mechanicus personnel granted temporary clearance to analyse planetary debris retrieved from the surface. His private data log was later confiscated but partially reconstructed from archived fragments. The samples resist classification. Every time we attempt to disassemble the lattice structure, it reforms under the microscope. It's not repairing, it's recalibrating. The material behaves like code written in matter. I have begun to suspect that each crystalline segment retains memory of its configuration. This is not metal, not crystal, not organic. It is something between. We may be looking at an interface rather than an organism. Destera was declared unfit for service following the report and reassigned to a remote data refinery on Seraphon 9. The Mechanicus later declared all recovered samples to be destroyed under Inquisition directive. Among the most disturbing testimonial fragments originates from a psyker assigned to interpret psychic fluctuations detected across Murder's upper atmosphere. His identity was erased from all records, but a transcript of his final debriefing survived within a redacted archive. When I touched the resonance field, it felt like touching a thought that was not mine. It did not speak, but it remembered. I saw glimpses, endless corridors of web, light travelling through them like blood through veins. Then silence. It knows it was broken. It wants to be whole again. The psyker expired during the session, exhibiting symptoms consistent with total neural burnout. The Inquisition labelled the event Cognitive Contagion Fatality. The full transcript remains classified under Ordo Xenos Alpha restriction. The pict-feed evidence and testimonies together form a fragmented narrative that the Inquisition has never publicly acknowledged, that the Megarachnid planetary network may have functioned as more than a defensive infrastructure, perhaps a planetary intelligence distributed across physical structures and atmosphere alike. While this interpretation remains speculative, it aligns with observations of residual energy patterns and electromagnetic harmonics persisting long after biological extinction. Final Inquisition analysis of Murder concludes with the acknowledgement that certain questions must remain unanswered. The planet, though lifeless, continues to emit measurable phenomena incompatible with natural decay. Attempts to model its structural harmonics reveal repeating patterns, some resembling human neural wave frequencies. Whether this is coincidence, residue, or deliberate design cannot be proven. Yet the pattern's existence has been verified by multiple independent Inquisition data centers. The Ordo Xenos official statement summarizes its stance in the simplest terms. Murder has not forgotten. The planet persists in memory. Do not disturb the silence. From a strategic perspective, the Inquisition views Murder as a sealed relic, a monument to the hubris of Xenos civilization, and a warning against unrestrained adaptation. However, within closed circles, several senior Inquisitors have expressed quiet dissent. They argue that what was discovered on Murder was not merely a remnant of alien warcraft, but a demonstration of how a world could become self-sustaining thought, an ecological intelligence engineered to preserve itself through any extinction. These interpretations, though heretical by Imperial standard, persist in sealed data threads passed between Inquisitors of the Ordo Xenos and the Ordo Malleus. The possibility that the planet might one day reawaken remains an unspoken concern. It has been noted that all pict-feeds of the surface taken after the final quarantine show faint movement among the spire shadows, indistinct but consistent. In each frame, the pattern is identical, the faint outline of a descending shape, as though the Megarachnids' silhouettes remain etched upon the world, repeating the last moments of their defense forever. In the end, the Inquisition's final thoughts on murder are not written in the language of victory but of restraint. The Ordo's commentary, declassified in limited circulation, reads, "What we found upon murder was not an enemy, but a lesson. That knowledge, once awakened, does not die. That memory, once encoded in the bones of a world, endures beyond the flesh that made it. The Megarachnids are gone, yet their echo remains. We choose not to listen, not because we cannot, but because we must not." And so murder remains untouched, a planet locked in perpetual observation, its surface scarred by war, its depths humming with quiet purpose. The pict-feeds grow dimmer with each passing century, the static thicker, the silence heavier. Yet within that silence, the watchers of the Ordo know there is still movement, faint and rhythmic, like a thought dreaming beneath the stone.